So I wanted to maybe start with one of the first questions. I had a great honor to meet you in Florence, and
Yes.
I think everyone probably wants to know what brought you to Florence, what brought you to Renaissance, and also
More questions, don't you?
yes, they're really interesting questions, and I wanted to kind of think about Renaissance and how did the history open up to you?
Okay. Well, I'm one of those people who have history in my blood. I've always been passionate about it. I grew up loving historical fiction. Uh, I then studied I then studied fiction. Sorry, I've just had a text, but I'm going to leave it behind. Okay. Um, I loved historical fiction. I read hundreds of books. I then studied history very seriously at a very good English university, and basically had all the romance beaten out of me by an academic education. But I never lost that kind of sense of an umbilical cord back to the past. And in all my work as a journalist, I was always looking for the context, the history, the roots, where we grew from. And then about 20 years ago, having started writing crime fiction, I found myself in Florence for a period of time on my own. Now, anybody who has ever visited Florence will have exactly, I am sure, the same reaction I did. It was not a period I had studied historically, so I was quite new to it, although I knew art history. And the question that comes to you as you walk those streets is, what the hell happened here 550 years ago to make this small little parochial city in the kind of northwest of Italy the cauldron for one of the greatest cultural revolutions that Europe has ever seen? And the more research I did, I thought, my God, if one could write a novel that recaptured the sense of the shock of the new that they must have felt living in Florence as this cultural explosion took place around them. The rebirth of classicism, the understanding suddenly of the technical ability to put the world around you into almost 3 dimensions onto the walls and on canvases, the philosophical ideas that went, the religious questioning that went with it, the architecture, everything. And if you could somehow write a book that brought that excitement to life for a modern day audience, wouldn't that be great? Well, it's a great idea. How do you do it? And then the second part, because novels always start with many different genesis, the second part that took place is I had been in Florence for a couple of weeks on my own, studying the history. I was little Miss Know-it-all about the Renaissance in Florence. And my daughters came to join me. They'd been on holiday with their dad in Spain, and I had them for a whole week at the end. And they were at the time 10 and 13 years old.
Wow.
And I thought, oh God, look, I know everything about this extraordinary moment in history. I think you should know it too. What a good time to teach you. So I took them out into the Piazza of Santa Croce, which is near where I was living. And I said to them at the beginning of the day, okay, guys, so here's what we're going to do. Today, we're going to go around museums and art galleries and churches, and I am going to show you what happened here 550 years ago to make this the blah, 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 blah. And the 13-year-old, who went under the nickname of Trouble on a Stick in our house, turned to me and said, very nice, Mum, but I think you should know that at this time in my life, I don't do culture, I just do shopping. And the 10-year-old, who was basically on the earth to get up her sister's nose at this point, went, oh, that sounds really interesting, Mum, I'll come with you. And so I found myself walking with these 2 very stroppy young women around Florence. And I suddenly realized I had an enormously hard sell on my hands, because absolutely everything that I was going to show them had a man's name attached to it. So the architects, the artists, the rulers, the political thinkers, the religious leaders, the philosophers, anybody you wanted to talk about that was famous within the history books was a man. And I asked myself a second enormously fundamental question, which was, did women have a renaissance? what was it like to be a woman during this moment in history? And my younger daughter had the ability at 10 to draw and paint very well. She had a sort of natural talent for it. And I thought, there must have been young women with good educations and backgrounds who adored the cultural excitement going on and who wanted to be part of it. And why don't we know any of their stories? And that was basically the genesis for the study that I then did to write The Birth of Venus.
Wow. You know, it was a hard sell. I think anything is a hard sell with the kids that age, you know, but I think you did really well, because I think that curiosity then opened up a whole new, you know, door for you. How did the history open up to you in Florence, and how did you, you know, find that female character?
Well, of course, one of the things that had changed since I read history 322 years ago, you know, because I was a great deal older when I finally arrived in Florence, was, of course, and this is the big revolution, history itself had changed in that period of time. You know, when I was at Cambridge University, I don't think I wrote a single female name in any essay I wrote.
Wow.
And that was how we looked at the past. Well, needless to say, in the last 30 or 40 years, feminism has had the most extraordinary impact on history. And so that question that I asked myself, did women have a Renaissance, had indeed exactly that question had been asked by a scholar called Joan Kelly. So when I went back in order to do my research, what I discovered is that there was a vast underground lake of history that scholars were trying to penetrate about women. So for instance, and you will know this being in Florence, we now know that there was one extraordinary woman painter in Florence in the early 16th century, and her name was Plautilla Nelli,
Yeah.
right? They've
Yeah.
just unveiled a restored Last Supper that she did last year. Now, she wasn't even known about, she was the abbess of a convent. So it was stuff like this that was coming to the fore. So I had all of this going on. That, if you like, is the academic work you do when you're trying to write about history. And then you want to bring it alive. And to bring it alive, you have to find character. So I started to revisit all the places I'd been to in Florence with another question in my mind. I'm looking on the walls for women, and I'm looking for real women. I don't want Mary Magdalene. I don't want Mary. I don't even want Botticelli's Venus. I want to know what real women I find, okay? And I'm just going to show you a couple of versions of what I found, because this, I think, is one of the most amazing, amazing images. And I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to put myself into slideshow, and now I'm going to share it with you.
Thank you.
It? Great.
Yes.
All right. This woman, who is clearly a nobody, a not famous woman. She's an extra. And there were so many extras in this art at the period of time. This woman I found in the very early Renaissance chapel of the Brancacci in the Carmini convent. And Brancacci, as you will probably know, is one of the very first extraordinary painters to bring this level of humanity and three-dimensionality into what, of course, were biblical stories. And this woman is in the tribute money part of the altar in the Brancacci. And she just caught my eye because look at her, she's a real woman, right? She's probably in her 20s or whatever, maybe younger. She's on the streets and she's doing what a woman of her time would have done. She's got a baby in her arms. And I'm just going to point out the wonderful physicality.
Yes, yes.
I now know that you could write a monograph on babies' bottoms in the Renaissance. Don't wear nappies or diapers. But she was a revelation to me because it meant that Masaccio had seen her and wanted to put a real woman onto the walls. And that, of course, is what Renaissance art was all about. We talk about humanism and the arrival of humanism. And that is basically about reassessing the human being next to God. And so what they do is they take their biblical subjects, of course, all art was basically religious before we get our hands on Venus, but the extras, the people around are real people. And that is also the next painting I want to show you. So this comes from the church of Santa Maria Novella, which is right by the station in Florence, and it is part of the main altar. And it was painted by Ghirlandaio in the 1480s. In fact, we know exactly when it was painted because there is an entry in a diary by an apothecary who has a chemist shop just opened by the Palazzo Strozzi. And he writes in his diary on December, I think it's the 12th, 1482, this chapel opens. Ghirlandaio painted it, and he was paid 1,000 gold florins for doing it, which I think is real proof that not only was Florence in the middle of a revolution, that her citizens knew she was, that is a citizen proud enough, a chemist, to write about this moment. Now this is there's two walls there. The left-hand side wall is the life of the Virgin Mary, and the second is the life of John the Baptist. This is the first painting in the life of the Virgin Mary, and it is actually the birth of the Virgin. So this is the Virgin's mum in bed, just having postpartum, having given birth. And here is, you don't normally see the Virgin quite like this, Virgin as a baby. But of course, what this is an excuse for Ghirlandaio to do a kind of Homes and Gardens 1488 version of what Florence was like with its wealth and its patronage at that time. So her birth takes place in a Florentine palazzo, right?
Yeah.
And because of course they're making films without having a moving image, lots of things are going on. Here's Mary and Elizabeth meeting, just in case you need to know what the history's going to be. And then here are all the people coming to visit the birth mother. So what you have is both, and these people all belong to the Turnaboinu family, who had paid Ghirlandaio to paint it. So you pay the painter enough money, you get on the walls too, to show how much wealth and influence you've got. But so what's fascinating about this is you're partly looking at a biblical scene, but you're partly looking at a slice of social history in Florence. So if you look at, let me move that. If you look closer, just look at the real people in this. Look at the way the servant is coming in and pouring this into the bowl. Look at the way this young woman, probably the first wet nurse, is actually holding on to the baby and looking. And such is the level of detail in the dress that Ghirlandaio goes into here, that we can actually remake Renaissance fashions from, say, 1488 by studying Ghirlandaio. So Ghirlandaio became, in a sense, my Bible, because of course the more I got to know my artists, and I knew what I was looking for. And because I so liked how Ghirlandaio gave me the social history, I can write about a palazzo, having seen this painting, as well as a moment, or I can write about costume. I started to look for women that he painted, and I came across two remarkable images. And I hope you'll agree with me. Both of these are paintings by Ghirlandaio. They're both portraits. They're both young women. You can tell a certain amount about their age. They're both wearing coral necklaces, which is an image of their purity. So you are looking at girls who I think would be 14 or 15. This young beauty is actually in the National Gallery's collection in London, except she's not on show. She's in storage, something that makes me...
In fact, I have never seen her live, yes.
It's an amazing portrait. And I saw her and I thought, I know who The Birth of Venus is about. It's about a young woman like this, because there was something in that portrait, particularly this one, that had a level of sort of self-containment and concentration and intelligence. So this is a young woman who would have probably had a reasonable education. She would probably be about to be married, but there is intelligence and determination in those eyes. And I thought, I think she could be my Alessandra Cecchi. And so inspiration came from Ghirlandaio to paint the figures in The Birth of Venus.
Wow, wow. I think Ghirlandaio is probably one of the most underestimated artists of the Renaissance.
Yes, do you know why? I think it's because his name is so bloody difficult to spell. it took me 4 spell checks the first time I did it, because there's so many H's and I's and R's and D's and A's and I's and O's. But I
Yes.
completely agree. I think he has a humanity to him and a dramatic depth that absolutely aces anybody you put next to him, really.
Yes, yes. And you know, he's operating in Florentine society. He has all these amazing commissions for Tornabonis. He's in Sassetti Chapel. So he has all these, you know, commissions that he's juggling at the same time. And he just imagined the army of people who were working with him. And then the young Michelangelo who comes to his studio.
Yes, in fact,
But
Michelangelo was one of the impressions, I mean, his young apprentice, on those pictures in the Santa Maria Chapel.
yeah,
But I mean, and we'll have this conversation again and again, won't we? Because in a sense, my commitment is not just to the big names. You know,
yes,
somebody asked a question which you sent through to me, which was, the Birth of Venus has a painter figure in it, right? And because Michelangelo appears in the book, when people read the book, they always assume that I'm really writing about a young Michelangelo. Now, actually, it is clear from the book that it's not Michelangelo.
of course.
And people say, well, who is it? And my answer is, it really doesn't matter. There were a huge number of extraordinarily talented painters during this moment.
Yes,
You don't make a revolution from only 2 superstars.
exactly.
And many of them will never have become famous in the way Michelangelo does. But we need to recognize, and I think the very last paragraph of Birth of Venus says this, because my young woman becomes a painter, we need to recognize that it wasn't just star operatic figures. This was a chorus. There were a lot of people making this artistic revolution. And so a young painter is somebody who comes from the north, bringing a very different sensibility. The Northern Renaissance was very different. We know that Dürer came from the north. We know that Roger van der Weyden came from the north for a period, but he isn't anybody famous. He's the also-ran. And
Yeah.
they were as important to history as the superstars, I think.
Exactly, exactly. You know, I can't wait to see what other images you have for us. I know we talked about Botticelli also, and you know, his complete fascination with the Divine Comedy and how he, according to Vasari, dedicates last years of his life after Savonarola is already gone to the Divine Comedy.
Yes, well, that's a great surprise to many people, because, of course, when you say Botticelli, of course, you think of the Uffizi and you think of Primavera and you think of the Birth of Venus, etc. But Botticelli had a very powerful religious streak, particularly after Savonarola comes into power. In fact, we know that he threw some paintings on the bonfire of the Vanities. But I was particularly interested in his Divine Comedy illustrations, because the Divine Comedy is so important within the Renaissance. You know, it's
Yes.
like after Shakespeare, Shakespeare continues to plait his way into British culture throughout the centuries. He isn't just famous then, he grows throughout the centuries. And both with the Boccaccio and with Petrarch and with Dante, they were the kind of early Shakespeares of their time.
Yeah.
And even to this day, I mean, I've gone around churches in Italy and met old men who've shown me the churches, and they can recite screeds of Dante's Divine Comedy off by heart because they've learned it in school. But I'll show you just 2 images
Okay.
from. This is an image from hell, right? So Dante doesn't actually, he does illustrations to the whole thing. Many of them get lost. We think that he is commissioned by the Medici to do it, but during the first French invasion, when Charles brings his army into Florence, somebody gives some of these paintings to Charles and they go back to France. So these paintings get scattered all over Europe, and it takes a long time to gather them together. We don't have all of them, but we have a number of them. We think that originally they would have all been wanted to be colored. So his aim was to color everything, right? And what I love about this, of course, hell is so exciting. It's just so dramatic, right? There's a moment in the Birth of Venus when her husband sort of says to her when showing her these things, you know, we'd all like to go to heaven, but it would be pretty boring compared to hell. And so I'm going to show you this, which is a really interesting version of hell. You wouldn't want to be feeling what they're feeling, but you probably might have liked the sins that got you there. And this is Beatrice appearing to Dante as he moves up into heaven, which is a beautiful piece of drawing, but I just think this is a lot more interesting. And I think that that shows you the kind of tension going on within the Italian sensibility too. Heaven and hell don't exist for us anymore, except maybe in post-Freudian mental torment times. But they were incredibly important to the imagination of Renaissance man. And I think Botticelli does it really well by making hell colorful and dramatic and interesting. And of course, if you look really closely at some of his illustrations, you'll see that there are some famous people. There's a couple of kind of cardinals or whatever in there, because Dante's Divine Comedy is scurrilous and about knocking power. And it seemed just so much more interesting than this. I'm a Catholic, by the way, by birth. So all this is very, very close to my heart.
Yes. I love how it has the, Botticelli fingerprint all over it. His Beatrice is just as beautiful as his muses are, in the three graces in the Birth of Venus.
Yes, I think there's two painters for me in the Renaissance who don't know how to put a brush on the canvas without grace flowing out of it. He's one and Raphael is the other.
Wow.
And I think both of them have an ability to create female grace in a manner that nobody does. Give me them over Michelangelo every day. Michelangelo doesn't know, I'm about to be heretical, turn off your microphones. Michelangelo doesn't know how to paint women.
Yes.
Paint his body, but he doesn't know how to paint women. Neither, for my mind, does Leonardo. He can make them ethereal, but in terms of real women, maybe it's to do with their sexualities, I don't know. In terms of real women, Botticelli and Raphael and Ghirlandaio for me are the men.
Yes. So true. I think Michelangelo really had no interest in female body,
No.
so it comes from that as well.
When you've seen today in the Medici chapel and they're all lying there, I think they're just men's bodies with breasts stuck on them, actually. But we won't do any more because I know how popular he is.
Yeah. Sarah, they say that people in the world are divided into two groups, those that love Florence and those that love Venice.
Yeah.
So where are you? What is your, where are you in? Which group are you in?
Well, I lived on and off in Florence for 20 years. So of course I would have to argue that my heart would always be in Florence. And of course, there's a very good reason for that over Venice, as we know, because Florence still has some sense of being a contemporary, alive city, which is part of a modern sensibility and culture.
Yeah.
Where, as we know, and we can talk about pandemic in a moment, because we'll get there, I'm sure, Venice has suffered from becoming hollowed out by tourism.
Yeah.
And that has done us no favors when it comes to imaginatively attempting to reconstruct what Venice would have been in the 15th and 16th century, when basically nobody felt sorry for her because she's not a city sinking, she's a city ruling. She is one of the wealthiest, most powerful cities in the whole of Europe. And she has a stability and a pride and a kind of sense of self-esteem that barely any other city has. And of course, I could show you a million images to sum that up. But insofar as I think that art is the best tool we have for social history, I'm not going to show you that. I'm going to show you a portrait.
Oh.
This has to be one of the most beautiful portraits in the whole of art history.
Yes, I agree.
Giovanni Bellini, as you will well know, Paola. It is in the National Gallery and this is on the walls. It's painted around 1500 and it's a painting of Doge Loredan, who is the head of the Venetian state. And the reason I pick this painting to introduce you to Venice rather than a Canaletto or any other painting is this is not only a painting of beauty, it's a painting of propaganda. So you look at this man and what do you see? You see power, you see wealth, you see sagacity, you see wisdom, you see the rule of law, you see stability. You see, look at this material. You see a city dealing with trade and cloth. And that, of course, is exactly what Venice wants you to think about her. So here you have one painting that tells you more about the history, or as much about the history, as any other painting can. And the reason I love it so much is because, of course, it's true, Venice is all of those things, but it is also propaganda.
Yeah.
It's what they want you to think. And Venice has quite an underbelly at this period of time, which she will go on to be more famous for, because if you think about Venice, eventually you'll get to think about Casanova or whatever. But in this period of time, when I was looking to write about women, there aren't any women doges, there aren't any women senators, there aren't any women painters, but there are women in Venice who are getting onto the walls for one reason alone, because they're gorgeous, because they are courtesans. And here's where social history and art history come together. Courtesans are high-class prostitutes, and they are needed in Venice because the Venetian state is run by men, and a fixed number of families control the state of Venice, okay?
Yeah.
To make sure that those families continue to be oligarchic, they don't need too many of them. They don't need them to grow. So at a certain point, they institute a policy where if you have too many children as one of these families, you'll control what happens to them and not get married. And the women will be thrown into convents. That's another story. But the men will become forced bachelors. This does not mean that they can't have a good time. So these men go looking for not street prostitutes, but courtesans. And so what I wanted to write about was courtesan culture in Venice. And here art just falls into your lap. Here's one of the most famous paintings that you're likely to find in the Renaissance. And all of you out there will look at this and go, oh, I know this. This is the Venus of Urbino. This is Titian. Urbino. Well, it's called the Venus of Urbino because the Duke of Urbino sees it in Titian's studio in Venice in the 1530s and buys it and takes it and sticks it, surprise, surprise, in his bedroom in the Ducal Palace in Urbino. But we know, once again, thanks to that history and the scholars I've been talking about, we know that this woman actually was a courtesan. We know that she was a woman called Angela Zavetti. We know that she started life in Rome as a courtesan and left after the sack of Rome in 1527, that she came and became a friend of Titian and his good friend, the satirical writer Pietro Aretino. And we have letters from Pietro Aretino actually to her, describing her and talking about what a good courtesan she is, because she doesn't play off her rivals and she always gives you the time of day and she always thinks that she cares about you alone, a really classy professional woman. And so this painting, along with all the research I was doing, gave me the ability to enter, if you like, something really powerful, which is sexual culture in Venice during the 16th century. Because, of course, history doesn't get between the sheets very often. When you get into the bedroom, it tends to close. But sexuality it runs like a sort of live electric cable onto the ground of human history. And looking at the work of courtesans, which we now can, because historians have studied their wills, they've looked at where they left money, they know who they were, they studied their letters. We know some of them wrote poems, some of them ran salons, etc., etc. So we know a lot about them, and it's partly through art. And maybe this is a major masterpiece, this painting. Maybe if I now show you the other element, the other ingredient that I found through art to write in The Company of the Courtesan, you'll see how powerful art is in my research, which is that the more I learned about this woman, the more I thought, you are fascinating and I want the world to know about you, but it's not like you're an early feminist, okay? These women are not kind of early sisters together. They are individual players, entrepreneurs, running their own palaces, running their own businesses. And they're quite selfish and self-absorbed, and beauty is their transactional gift. And I thought if I tried to write from the first person of who she was, you wouldn't necessarily like her. And I needed you to understand her, to admire her and put her in a social context of Venice history. So I went looking for who was going to write the story. And I really didn't have any idea. I was in Venice trying to research the novel. And as part of it, I went to the Accademia Art Gallery. And in one room, I saw this painting. It's strange here because, of course, you can see the doorway that's been, some thug vandal later in history is put into this painting. This is a room in the Accademia which has full wall, floor to ceiling paintings by Carpaccio, Vittorio Carpaccio on one side, and by Bellini's brother on the other side. And like everything in this period, it is a religious story, but set in Venice. So this is the life cycle of St. Ursula. I really can't be bothered with St. Ursula because neither was Carpaccio really. St. Ursula's over here somewhere, right? But what this is, of course, is an excuse to paint the Rialto in Venice in the 1500s, to paint this mercantile empire at its best, to paint all these young bloods on the street. Not a lot of women, you will notice,
True.
right? Okay. But as I'm staring at this painting, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, gosh, there's one tiny figure here. And I'm just going to show you this area here. And then I'm going to move you on to this. Now he's moved to, oh, let's go. He's moved to the right here. Can you see him?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Go, right? And I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, well, I know what you are. You're a dwarf, right? That's what they were called then. So I'm going to name what they were called then. And I know you're a dwarf because of the shape of your body and because the perspective shows you very small near the hunting dogs that are quite large. But look at you. You are a dandy. You've got wealth and you've got attitude. Oh, I wonder who you are. And as I looked at it, I remembered being in the British Library in London about 3 months before, when I had been writing and researching the courtesan book. And I was reading a book on courtesan culture in Venice, where the writer described how courtesans kept, in inverted commas, exotic pets to entertain their clients. So they kept parrots that they taught to swear in Latin for when cardinals visited them, because of course clerics came to them too. And they kept monkeys that juggled, and they kept jesters and dwarves. And I thought, my God, you may be a small stature, but you probably have a very smart brain. You're a big brain, you're in Venice, you're on the streets. What if you were working for a courtesan? You get to see the culture all around you in a way she can't. You're probably the one man in Venice who's not interested in sleeping with her because she's your meal ticket, and you will see her warts and all. And it was in that moment in the Accademia that the character of Buccino, my dwarf, who is the first person narrator of Company of the Courtesan, was born. So I think you see, Paola, the way in which I'm always driven to the art. The art is the social history. The art brings it alive. The art gives me the people. But in the back, I've always got the academic and historical study to know what they're doing there, to give them kind of graft so that the characters grow out of the historical reality. And for me, that's enormously important in historical fiction. It is very easy for historical fiction just to be the likes of you and I in pretty bodices and dresses, okay? For us always to think, oh, look at them, they were exactly the same as us. Well, actually, in some ways, they were the same as us, but they grew from a very different culture, a very different sense of sensibilities, very different political and religious circumstances. And to understand that, you have to grow them out of their own soil. And from that, you need a mixture of the British Library and every art gallery and church you can visit.
Wow. Wow. Amazing, amazing how the inspiration is everywhere for someone as creative as you are. But I think he, but he makes his way into the book in a really beautiful way, and he is the perfect character to tell it all because he's also an outsider. He's in, but
Yes,
he's also an outsider.
yes, yes.
I'm looking at our time. I
Okay.
cannot believe how quickly the time is going by. I wanted to just very quickly just mention this book, Blood and Beauty.
Yeah.
How hard was it to, or how hard or easy was it to research Borgia family and to write about them?
Well, this is really interesting because another question that came to you, which you sent to me early, was about the role of historical writers setting the history straight. And somebody mentioned that they'd been reading Hilary Mantel and the work that she'd done on Thomas Cromwell. I have to say, for me, there's too much Tudor history in the world. Everybody knows the Tudors, but there's a whole rich panoply out there. And when I was looking for women to continue to study in the Renaissance, there is one woman in history who has been given the worst time by historians that it's possible to imagine. Her surname is Borgia, and her Christian name is Lucrezia Borgia.
Lucrezia, of course, of course.
Oh, for evil, a poison, incest, voluptuousness, rapid sensuality, sexuality, murder, you name it. Lucretia's meant to have done it. And the truth is, it was all, or a huge amount of it, was scandal and gossip because the Borgia had lots of enemies. And it was extremely easy to slander women during this period of time.
Interesting.
There is a double standard going on here, as you know, from all of these courtesans. Men can go out and basically have sex with who they want. Married men are not supposed to be faithful to their wives. That's accepted, right? So they've sinned, so they go to confession and they do it again, right? Women have to be purer than pure. Certain things have not changed that much in our, we can talk about that.
True.
And Lucretia, because of a series of things that her father orchestrates for her, because she's a dynastic pawn, becomes open to the kinds of scandal that I've described. So my research was to go back and find out who the real Lucretia Borgia was. And this is very interesting in terms of art. I'm just going to show you this painting. This painting is from the Borgia apartments in Florence. The Borgias aren't known for their art patronage. They were very busy trying to create a dynasty. But the Borgia apartments were painted by a man called Pinturicchio, who at the time in the 1490s was his own superstar in Rome. He was
Sure.
Mr. Fashion. And he's not fashionable now, although I think you can see this is an extraordinary painting. And every inch of the Borgia apartments is covered with illustration. And this is from the Room of the Saints. And this is the story of Saint Catherine of Alexandria disputing with the emperor, right? And this is the only reliable known portrait we have of Lucretia Borgia.
Wow.
Wow. Other portraits were painted afterwards. The Borgias were so unpopular after they died that people came in and whitewashed them off the walls. It's a bit like in Egypt when another pharaoh comes in and smashes the cartography of the pharaoh behind. And this was painted, we know, when she was 13 years old. She was 13 when her father became Pope, and Pinturicchio used her as the model. And let's just look at that face. And so my job was to tell the story about how this 13-year-old girl, who will have 3 husbands by the time she's 21, because she is a pawn in a dynastic game, how this young woman has come to be seen by history as evil incarnate, and what was her true story.
Wow.
And the research for that just opened a whole world. The 1490s and the corruption of the Catholic Church. And if there's one thing that I learned during that period, and I really put it forward to people studying the Renaissance, is that all of the words that we think about when we think about the Borgias, murder, brutality, corruption, incest, all of this, you could as well use to describe the 15th century in which they lived. That this explosion of beauty and cultural revolution comes out of a force of energy and economic expansion and patronage, of which the church has won, but it is not without corruption. So the Catholic Church is corrupt. What do you want? You want the Sistine Chapel or a non-corrupt Catholic Church? Because they are paying for a huge amount of the great art you see. And the Borgias, yes, are probably more egregiously corrupt than others, but they are not alone in it. And so to study this period of history, what you are basically studying is the lead up to the moment when in 1517, Luther will nail his treatise to the doors of Wittenberg and a revolution will take place, which is not about culture, it's about religion. So every time you go back into this past, what you are doing is looking at the tectonic plates of history as they're moving. And the trick of being the historical novelist is to tell it in a way where you don't feel that you're learning the history.
Yes.
You feel you're reading a story and you want to know what happened.
And this is where your magic comes in. You're able to do this for all of us, which is an extraordinary gift.
Well, it was my first love, right? I was pulled into history by story.
Yes.
And therefore, I think it's vitally important that if you tell it, first of all, you make it a damn good story. And secondly, you get your facts right.
Yes.
The facts are there to be known. And if you get your facts right, the psychological portrait of the people that you are trying to create will be true to their roots in all of their complexities. Which probably means I could just introduce you to the very last person who I'm working on at the moment.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
I wanted to tell you so now it's we have about 15 more minutes, okay?
Okay, I can do this
So,
in 5 minutes, very fast.
oh, I love that you're going to tell us about your next, your new research and what you're doing now, which is so extraordinary and very exciting. So
I am 80,000 words into a novel at the moment of this woman. Actually, she doesn't look anything like this woman, but I'll come to that in a moment. This is a portrait by Titian of Isabella d'Este. Now, for those of you who don't know your Renaissance, and why should you in the minuscule detail I do, Isabella d'Este is born into the small city-state of Ferrara in the late 15th century. She marries into another powerful small city-state in Mantua, both of which are little Renaissance jewels of cities, because the Renaissance doesn't just happen in Rome or Venice or Florence. The reason Italy is the cauldron of it is because there are many little city-states with rulers who have the money and the education to want to be players in this cultural revolution, okay? And Isabella d'Este is the first serious woman patron that we have in the history of art. She's born into beauty, she has a natural affinity for it, and she will go on to create a collection of Renaissance art, which is unparalleled by a woman at any point. It doesn't exist anymore because along with the rest of the Mantuan art, when Mantua goes bust in the mid-17th century, it gets bought. It gets bought by Charles I before he has his head chopped off. And then that whole collection goes on sale and is scattered throughout Europe.
wow.
But Isabella d'Este is a fantastic character because when we talk about diversity in history, one of the things, and I think this is a very big question now with what we're going through also with diversity and race and Black Lives Matters, etc., is that one of the things that we wanted to do first when we rediscovered women is we wanted to say, look, you've ignored us for so long. I'm going to show you who these women were in history. And almost inevitably, we had two versions of them. One was, they were so incredible. We don't know them. They were fantastic. And the other one was, they were so oppressed and they were so badly treated that we have to now look at who they were. And both of those things were true, but the reality, of course, is that women, just like men, come in all shapes and sizes and forms and characters and whatever. And if you're really going to finally have them stand as tall in history as men, then you aren't always seeing that they're goddesses or victims. And Isabella d'Este is perfect because she's flawed, right? She is powerful, she's greedy, she's vain, she's opinionated, she's entitled, she's a snob, she's smart, and she is just such a colourful, flamboyant woman. And she left behind her an archive of some 16,000 letters.
I know.
Just before the coronavirus hit, I was in Mantua in the State Archive in January, studying those letters. I'd like to pretend that I could read every single one of them in these tiny handscripts in medieval Italian. That was really difficult. But so she's the character, and what's great about her is she's the original photoshopper, right? She is not a good-looking woman. She very early on has an extremely sweet tooth and starts to spread.
I love her.
And when she gets herself painted, if she doesn't like the result, she ditches the painting. So Mantegna, another fabulous figure in art history, does a painting of her, and she just destroys it because she says it doesn't look like her, which probably means it looks exactly like her. She commissions Titian to paint this painting, and the age she is when he delivers it is 63. Okay. So the story is that Titian did a painting of her and sent it, but it obviously didn't look like this. So she sent to him another painting that she'd had commissioned 30, 40 years earlier, which had also been kind of made her more beautiful, and said, copy this, but put these clothes on it. Because the other thing she is an archive, an icon of fashion. Yeah. So what you have here is a woman who controls in a way that hardly anybody in her period does, right down to the images that she gives us of herself through history. And my task, if you like, is to make her, warts and all, really likable. I should say that sometimes when I leave you, I'm going to go downstairs and have dinner with my husband. And there are odd moments when I'm working on Isabella d'Este when I will find myself being very bossy. To my husband, am I being really bossy? I think I might be channeling.
You're channeling Isabella.
And his priceless remark was, it's better than being 3 years in the company of Cesare Borgia.
Oh my gosh.
I think probably that's my last word for the pictures.
You have to say hello to Anthony. I'm sure it's not easy to sit with you as you are so immersed in your research and you're doing, you're thinking about it. I had the pleasure to have dinner with you one night and you were just finishing, was it Blood and Beauty?
Yeah.
And yes, I remember, just how much you lose track of time, the day and night don't really matter. Yeah. I think that's absolutely incredible. I wanted to ask you one thing, and I think it's really wonderful to, with all the guests I had the honor to have, is to talk about what we can learn from history. And okay, what would be the one thing that you could, connecting to our really difficult times, the pandemic, what rings the bell?
Okay, well, two things, and I'll do them very fast. And the first is pandemic. The first is plague. We have been hit by a disease that we have never come across before, that is highly contagious, that will kill us, that we have no cure from, and we're panicking because it's moving really fast. History is full of these moments. I have been researching how Isabella d'Este runs the city of Mantua while her husband is away. And one of the jobs she has is controlling what happens when the bubonic plague breaks out again. The Black Death,
Wow.
of course, was 2 centuries ago, but we never found a cure for the Black Death. So what happens is it keeps coming back. And as I was researching this is what happens in 1506 when the plague gets close. First of all, Mantua closes the city gates against all visitors coming from a place where they might have connected with the plague. Right, there you go. The airport,
Wow.
train stations of today, right? Secondly, you set up a quarantine hospital, usually just outside the city gates, and people who show symptoms are taken into the quarantine hospital where they will have to stay. Quarantine originally comes from 40 days. They have to stay there for that length of time until either they contract it and possibly die, so you've got priests in there with doctors, or they're allowed to go free. And then if there are areas of the city where it's just getting out of hand, they cordon off the whole area of the city and it goes into lockdown. And they police a lockdown. The only thing that's allowed in is food and doctors. And the final element is, and tell me if this isn't a description of now, that a good government understands that there will be a terrible economic toll as a result of this. And so what they will do is they will check what the price of corn is or the price of wheat is for bread, and they will release more supplies to make sure that the poor aren't suffering too much. And when the
Wow.
plague is finally passed, they will bring people out of those quarantine hospitals and there will be processions to celebrate the fact, because the missing cog in this is God, you know, thank you God, it's all over now, and they will give them arms to start a new life. So I think that what we have to learn from the past is that you have to be humble when stuff hits you that you don't know. And with any luck, history will give you some advice as to how to handle it. And the other huge thing I have learned about studying this period of the past is don't underestimate the power of religion. That we may have come through an enlightenment, we may feel that science and humanism and secular culture and those things are how we define our civilizations, but religion is always bubbling powerfully underneath. And the very fact that it gives solace to some during terrible times means that it also has enormous power. So the battle between science and religion that I see fighting out in the moment, you could argue we are seeing now between what some religious fundamentalists think is fake news about science telling them about a contagion and what is the real news about what science is trying to do. When you look at in Islamic fundamentalism or Christian fundamentalism, they are more interested in what happens after this world than they are what happens now. So those things have been going on throughout human history. And certainly when I came, for instance, to write The Birth of Venus, just to wrap this up where we began, I was writing it while the Taliban were in control of Afghanistan, where there was a theocracy in power, where women weren't allowed to go to church, when they had to be veiled, when dancing and gambling was not allowed. That's exactly what happens in Savonarola's Florence in the 1490s. So
Wow.
there's always a lesson to be learned from the past. And it doesn't mean we have to repeat it. In fact, it's only if you learn the lesson that it probably means you stand a good chance of rising above it.
Yes. You know, so many things that you said tonight are quotes. I have been trying to write them down because it's really extraordinary. And you know, think about when Italy got into the lockdown. One of the first things the Pope did in Rome, he actually went to pray to the miracle working crucifix in Rome. And then they brought in the miracle working icon. And I
Yes.
don't know, remember, I think the whole world was watching when he was praying, you know, in the deserted square of St. Peter, and just, you know, with this icon, and it was pouring rain. So the whole thing kind of worked together.
Yeah, yes. And it is interesting, isn't it? Why can't it be both? You know, why can't it be okay to wear a mask and take seriously science, but also have a belief in God.
Yes.
They ought to move hand in hand. And I think one of the interesting things for now is science has been proved to have to be humble about this pandemic.
Yes.
I
Yes.
have friends who are epidemiologists who work for public health in England, and one of the things I hear them say more than ever before is, we don't know. We don't know. And you could argue that science has in the past had a kind of arrogance when it comes to religion, right? The whole
Yes.
Richard Dawkins fight against, fools are people who believe. Well, it's a complex thing what human beings need. They need science. They need to understand. They also need some kind of faith. And I don't necessarily mean in a God, but I mean some kind of faith. They need something other than just the facts. And
Yes.
I think studying history shows you the intertwining of that all the time.
Yes, yes, yes. Fascinating, fascinating. And just how deeply religious someone like Leonardo or Michelangelo were. I have to say, my last question, it might be a silly question, Sarah, forgive me, but of all of your books, which one would you like to see on a big screen?
Oh God, I don't want to see any of them. They'll be completely F star, 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 star up. Would, honestly. No, if there's one thing I've learned, it's really hard to put this stuff onto film because it has to fit into neat stories. However, I can tell you which one because I know they'll never do it.
Okay.
And that is Sacred Hearts, which is the book set in a convent, which is the other job that women did big time during the Italian Renaissance. They prayed for the purity of everybody else by being shoved into convents. And that was a book entirely set in a convent, no male characters in it whatsoever. And it was about the culture of how those women lived and what they did. And I think that would make a fantastic psychological thriller about female power, because abbesses were like ruling small little states there. They were running the government.
Yeah.
So I'd be very, very interested to see that one, either on film or on stage.
And who would be the main role? I mean, if you had a dream cast, who would it be? I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot here, but...
God. Well, I used to think that Saoirse Ronan could be the young Serafina. And I'm a tremendous fan of an American actress called Annette Bening.
Oh, yes.
I think would be terrific. I'm a bit tired of the English theatrical lovies. I think it would be fine not to see either Helen Mirren or Judi Dench.
Okay.
They're a bit like Leonardo and Michelangelo. You see them like everywhere. I would prefer to take people I didn't yet know and put them in Wimples and try and imagine their inner life.
Yeah. Love it.
How about Meryl Streep in Doubt?
Oh, yes. Well, yes.
Characterization.
Terrific play originally, and then a film, actually, and I agree. She did a wonderful job, as did Philip Seymour Hoffman. God rest his soul, one of the great actors. Yeah.
I think, well, let's see what happens. You never know. We might be going to the premiere one day. I just wanted to ask you, okay, so let me see, some questions are here coming in. There's so many. Penny is saying this was an amazing talk. Yes, excellent, thank you. Robert Ross says absolutely fascinating. Donna Sturm, excellent presentation. Durant deserves to have much larger audience. And of course she does. She's on BBC. This was just a favor to a friend. And I'm so honored, Sarah, that you were so generous with your time and with your research and the ideas. Truly an honor.
Absolutely a pleasure. As you can see, press me and I will continue to talk about the Renaissance.
Well, I hope we can do this again. All right, let's see. Barbara Hollowell, shout out to Paola for bringing such fantastic interviews. Bravo, grazie. Neville, magical, provocative, informative, absolutely wonderful. And that is what Sarah is. Donna Malin, fantastic discussion. Elizabeth Heron, such a dynamic speaker with such an apparent love for what she fuels with creativity. Cheers. Patricia Cronin, great conversation. Speaker of the House in the US, Nancy Pelosi is devout Catholic, says science is the answer to our prayers.
Yes. Well, that's interesting. I'm a great fan of Pelosi. My God, octogenarian women are running the world at the moment. Her and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, between the two of them, may they hold the fort.
Yes, you know, I think they're mostly people are just saying thank you for our time. Paige is asking I have yet to read one of your books. Which one would you suggest I begin with?
Oh, I'd start with The Birth of Venus.
Yeah.
I would. Because I think in The Birth of Venus, to quote a horrible cliche, you can feel the love. Do you know what I mean? The book grew out of love. I was in love with the Italian Renaissance, and I was in love with the idea of what it would have been like to be a young woman educated in humanism, wanting to get your hands on the wall, to be part of that chorus of creativity. And I didn't yet know what I was doing. Do you see what I mean? It was a beginner's luck. That book was extremely successful. Now I read it, of course, and I see only what's wrong with it. But what I do know is that it has about it a kind of passion. I'm a better writer now. My historical knowledge is infinitely greater. Isabella d'Este, I hope, will be a very complex character, but you can just feel it. You can feel somebody who walked the streets in Florence and fell in love.
Yeah. And that is what resonates with the readers, I feel, you know, whoever picks up the book. Yes, I see Annette Bening would be perfect. Liz Heron, who is, by the way, an actress, saying this.
Right.
As did Sherry Jones on Broadway.
Right.
Oh,
Penny Hansen is asking who painted the Doge portrait. It was Giovanni Bellini. Giovanni Bellini. Karen is asking, has she done a book on Isabella de Medici? You mean Isabella d'Este, Karen? The book is
Isabella de Medici. No, there is a book about Isabella de Medici. She's a 16th century, later 16th century, by I think Carolyn Murphy, but it's not a fictional book. I think it's a scholastic book. No. And if I'm 80,000 words in, this one I'll finish, I know.
Do you think it will come next year? Will it come out next year?
No, because it'll take at least a year. And I haven't, actually, this is very interesting. Of course, if you're a writer, what you do after a period of time to earn your living is you always have a contract. So you're given an advance, you write the book. I didn't want a contract, I didn't want an advance. I didn't know what I was going to write next. I wanted to be left alone for a bit. And so Isabella grew out of being left alone. So this book, when it arrives, nobody will have asked for, you know, I'm sure it'll find a publisher, but it's me taking some risks. And it's also a book about history, actually, because it so grows out of that archive. The very first scene of the book is a young historian in the archive reading the letters, and Isabella d'Este hovering over her shoulder. Starts to read her own work and starts to think, what do you think of me through those letters? Let me tell you who I really am.
You know, if you're channeling Isabella, and I guess you are, by taking this risk to be free and to do something that you want to do, you know, not being obligated by the publishing houses, I can only imagine also Isabella being very picky about the cover of the book.
Dream on. You never get any say. I swear to God, you know, when they get published in other languages, I'll get something from an agent going, this company in Russia would like you to approve the cover for the book. And I see a picture of a woman dressed 2 centuries out of date with one breast hanging out. And I kind of go, yeah, whatever, because there's absolutely no point. They never get it right.
Yeah. Sarah, I see a few more questions, and mostly people just thanking you. I will send you the entire chat so that you can see how much everyone, of course, loved it. But Doris Song from Arizona is asking, what do you think of Sarah Bradford's book on Lucrezia?
I think it's pretty good, actually. I think it is.
Okay.
The first very good book was written by an Italian historian in the 50s, Maria Bellonci, and that was very good. And that did quite a lot of the archive work. Up until the late 19th century, we didn't even know a lot about those archives. Those archives were, this is an interesting story, those archives were in the Ducal Palace in Mantua. And when Italy becomes a unified state, they set up state archive in order that you can bring together the whole history. So they move everything out from the Ducal Palace. So much stuff, because the Gonzagas who run Mantua have kept everything. And they look at it all and think, it's not going to fit. We're not going to be able to put it in the old convent. What are we going to do with it? So they decide to burn some of it. And but you can see historians just sickening over this.
Oh my
What they
God.
burn, of course, is accounts. They go, oh, no, another set of accounts. And, oh, no. Well, of course, economic historians now write economic history from exactly the stuff that they burnt. And one of the things that makes Isabella d'Este so interesting is because she's so picky about her collection, and because she's so picky about what she wears, half of her letters are about, I'm sending you back this jewel because it isn't as big as you claimed it to be, and it's not worth 400 ducats, and there it is. Now I'd like 4 reams of the brocade cloth, and I want these buttons, and I'd also like this. And so you watch her being a kind of mistress both of fashion and of art, and talking about the dirty stuff, talking about money. If she can get it cheaper, she gets a bust from Rhodes of somebody she thinks is Homer, right? Who knows? It's just an old man, right? And it's cheap because his nose is chipped. So she takes it because she can't afford the stuff that's being dug up in Rome by the popes, because they, of course, are the wealthiest lot around. So.
Wow. Wow. Fascinating. One of the questions that came, Liz is asking, how many hours a day do you write? And are you structured about it, or does it kind of come freestyle?
When I was writing the first 5 of these books, it was my absolute full-time job, except when I was doing BBC work. And I would write at least 4 or 5, 6, 7 hours a day. I would find it very hard to stop. I promised myself and my partner with this Isabella d'Este book that I would not become as consumed. And now, of course, that's proved more difficult than I expected. But the genuine answer to that, of course, is when I'm not writing, I'm still writing. When I'm cooking, when I'm walking, when I'm cleaning, when I'm gardening, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I'm still absolutely in the character and in the story. And to such an extent, of course, that when they're finished, I'm lonely.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've recently had a kind of birthday, like a big birthday, a naught birthday. And the only thing I can think is, oh God, never stop writing, Sarah. Because if you carry on writing, you'll hang on in there to life, because it gives you a reason for being there. Yeah.
And I think, it is that curiosity that, we humans have that never stops.
No.
I think that is what really keeps us alive, what feeds our soul as well. And I think one of the fascinating things about the quarantine, what did people share on social media was not about someone's career or the successes they had in their career. It was about singing a beautiful song or writing a poem. So we came back to that creativity, which I think was the gift of these really hard times.
Yes. And I think that's true of the Renaissance. As I've said, the Renaissance was a brutal time. There was a great deal of violence. There was a great deal of corruption. We're wrong just to see it as some epitome of wonder and beauty, because exactly the same energy force that created that created massive wars, created torture. There is darkness and light within the human story. You can't just concentrate on one and forget the others. Somehow you have to clap them together.
Yes, 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 yes. Sarah, thank you so much for your time. I will make a recording.
What have you got for supper?
Yes.
Two friends arriving from London. I think they're probably downstairs now. My husband will most certainly have offered them a gin and tonic or a glass of wine. And he will probably have put a very nice pork belly in the oven, roasted with a little bit of bacon on the top of it and roasted vegetables. It will be fairly Renaissance, actually.
Wow, it sounds absolutely wonderful. And hopefully you will have some Bontalente's gelato at the end.
Yeah, I'm afraid it might be blackberry crumble because the blackberries are in season here.
Grazie mille. And I can't wait to see you in Florence, Sarah. I know you'll be back in no time.
I will be back. And it was a tremendous pleasure, Paola. You're doing a great job. And it was just a delight to talk to you. And it was a delight to talk to you all. I saw some faces, but not all. So good studying. And remember Ghirlandaio.
Ghirlandaio, yes, yes. Thank you, Sarah. Grazie mille. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a lovely weekend. And
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Grazie
you.
mille.
it was lovely to have everyone. Patty, lovely to see you. Lovely to see everyone. Lovely to see everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paula.
Thank you, Paula.
Ciao. Arrivederci.
We would never have this with you.
Right.
You know, my little contribution to the world these days. I think we all need to talk about beauty and be inspired. So
You've
thank
done
you.
it.
Thank you. I really feel.
Thank you
blessed.
very much.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Arrivederci.
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 Arrivederci.